Most people think they already know the story of Johnny Depp, the headlines, the court battles, the chaos. But what if the version the world accepted is incomplete, or worse, misunderstood? Behind the viral clips and public opinions lies a far more complex reality shaped by media framing, selective narratives, and moments taken out of context. This isn't about defending or attacking, it's about uncovering what was missed, what was ignored, and what was quietly proven but never amplified. Because sometimes the loudest story isn't the most accurate one, and sometimes the truth gets buried in plain sight. The story most people believe about Johnny Depp didn't begin with facts, it began with headlines. And headlines are designed for attention, not accuracy. When the allegations first surfaced, the narrative moved fast. Within hours, public opinion started forming, not based on full evidence, but on fragments, short clips, emotional statements, and carefully selected details that spread across social media like wildfire. This is how modern perception works. People don't wait for the full story anymore. They react to the first version they see. And in this case, that first version painted a very specific image that stayed in people's minds long before any court ever reviewed actual evidence. What many missed is that even early on, there were contradictions, but they weren't amplified. For example, audio recordings that later became public during legal proceedings revealed conversations that were far more complex than the original narrative suggested. In one widely discussed recording presented during the 2022 defamation trial, there were moments where both sides acknowledged arguments escalating beyond control. This didn't fit the simple story people had already accepted, so it didn't spread the same way viral accusations did. This is a pattern: information that confirms a belief travels faster than information that challenges it. Another key detail often overlooked is how the timeline was presented. When events are shown out of order, they create a distorted picture. During the court case in Virginia, multiple pieces of evidence including text messages, medical notes, and witness testimonies were introduced to establish context. Context is everything. Without it, even true statements can become misleading. For example, messages that appeared aggressive in isolation were, in some cases, responses to earlier situations that were not initially shared publicly. This doesn't excuse behavior, but it changes how that behavior is understood. Then there is the issue of selective credibility. When a person is labeled early in a controversy, everything they say afterward is filtered through that label. This is known in psychology as confirmation bias. Once the public leans toward one belief, they begin interpreting all future information in a way that supports it. During interviews outside the courtroom, legal analysts pointed out that many people had already formed conclusions before the trial even began. So when evidence was later presented under oath, it had to fight against an already established narrative. What's even more interesting is how the courtroom itself became a turning point. Unlike traditional cases that remain mostly private, this trial was streamed live. Millions of people watched testimony directly instead of relying on summaries. This changed everything. For the first time, audiences could observe tone, reactions, and inconsistencies in real time. And slowly, some perceptions began to shift. Not because of a single dramatic moment, but because of accumulation, days of detailed questioning, cross-examination, and documented evidence being laid out step by step. One example that stood out during the trial was the testimony regarding injuries and medical reports. Multiple professionals, including doctors and nurses, provided statements under oath. These weren't opinions, they were documented observations recorded at specific times. In legal terms, this kind of evidence carries significant weight because it is harder to manipulate after the fact. When these details were presented, they added layers to the story that had never been part of the viral narrative. The role of witnesses also deserves attention. People who were present during key moments, including staff and close associates, gave testimony that sometimes contradicted earlier public claims. In any legal case, consistency matters. When multiple independent witnesses describe similar patterns, it strengthens credibility. During cross-examination, both sides had the opportunity to challenge these accounts, and that process is designed to reveal inconsistencies if they exist. This is very different from social media, where statements often go unchallenged and are accepted at face value. But perhaps the most important aspect of this entire situation is how quickly public opinion can become permanent. Even after new information is introduced, many people don't update their views. This is not unique to this case, it's a broader human behavior. Once someone commits to a belief publicly, changing that belief feels like admitting they were wrong. So instead, they ignore or dismiss new evidence. This creates two parallel realities, one based on early impressions, and another based on later verified information. Interviews given after the trial also added important perspective. Legal experts, including former prosecutors and defense attorneys, analyzed how the case was argued and why certain evidence mattered more than others. They pointed out that legal truth is not decided by popularity, but by what can be proven with evidence under oath. This is a critical distinction that often gets lost in online discussions. The court doesn't operate on trends, it operates on proof. There is also a financial and professional dimension that rarely gets discussed honestly. Long before the trial concluded, there were already consequences. Major studios began distancing themselves, roles were lost, and public image shifted dramatically. This happened before a legal judgment was reached. It shows how powerful perception can be, sometimes more powerful than facts. Once a reputation is damaged, even temporarily, the effects can last for years regardless of the final outcome. And yet, despite all of this, there were moments during the trial where details surfaced that directly challenged the original narrative. These weren't minor points, they were significant contradictions supported by evidence. But by that time, the story had already been told so many times in a certain way that changing it became difficult. This is how narratives solidify. Repetition turns assumptions into accepted truth. What makes this situation different from many others is the level of transparency. Because the proceedings were public, anyone could verify what was actually said and shown. This removed the middle layer of interpretation that usually exists between events and public understanding. But it also revealed something uncomfortable, that many people prefer simplified stories over complex realities. Complexity requires attention, patience, and willingness to reconsider. Simplicity is easier to consume. And as more days of testimony unfolded, a clearer picture started forming, not a perfect one, not a one-sided one, but a human one. A situation involving conflict, mistakes, reactions, and consequences on both sides. This is often where public narratives struggle, because they rely on clear heroes and villains. Real life rarely fits that structure. By the time the court reached its decision, something else had already changed, the conversation itself. People who had only seen headlines were now debating specific pieces of evidence. Clips from testimony were being analyzed, compared, and questioned. For some, this led to a shift in perspective. For others, it reinforced what they already believed. But the important thing is that the full story had finally been made available, even if not everyone chose to see it that way. As that fuller picture continued to unfold, one thing became harder to ignore: the gap between what was said in court and what had already been accepted outside of it. People who followed the entire trial closely began noticing details that never trended, details that required attention instead of instant reaction. For example, during testimony, timelines were revisited again and again, with both legal teams trying to establish exactly when certain events happened and what evidence supported those claims. This process might seem slow, even repetitive, but it serves a purpose: it tests consistency. When a story remains consistent under pressure, it gains strength. When it changes, even slightly, those changes matter. In multiple instances, cross-examination revealed differences between earlier public statements and later sworn testimony. This doesn't automatically prove intent, but it raises questions. And in a courtroom, questions are everything. Attorneys are trained to identify even the smallest inconsistency because it can influence how the entire narrative is perceived. During the Virginia proceedings, several moments like this stood out, where statements were compared side by side with prior recordings or written evidence. These weren't dramatic viral moments, but they were significant in understanding the full context. Another layer that added complexity was the use of expert witnesses. Professionals from fields like psychology, medicine, and digital forensics were brought in to interpret specific aspects of the case. Unlike general opinions, expert testimony is based on specialized knowledge and is subject to strict standards. For instance, forensic experts analyzed metadata from photos and messages to determine when and how certain pieces of evidence were created or altered. This type of analysis is technical, but its impact is straightforward: it helps establish authenticity. Psychological experts also played a role in explaining behavioral patterns. Rather than labeling individuals in a simplistic way, they discussed how certain actions could be interpreted within broader patterns of conflict. This doesn't excuse behavior, but it provides insight into how situations escalate. And escalation was a recurring theme throughout the case: arguments that intensified, reactions that went too far, and moments where control was lost. These are uncomfortable realities, but they are part of understanding what actually happened. The way media outlets covered these developments also influenced public perception. While some platforms began sharing longer clips and full testimonies, others continued focusing on short, attention-grabbing segments. This created two very different viewing experiences. One audience saw a detailed, evolving case. Another saw isolated moments without full context. And because algorithms prioritize engagement, the more dramatic or emotionally charged clips often reached a wider audience. This brings up an important point about information flow. In today's digital environment, visibility is not always tied to accuracy. Content spreads based on how it makes people feel, not necessarily how complete it is. During the trial, certain clips were shared millions of times within hours, while full days of testimony went largely unwatched. This imbalance shapes understanding in subtle but powerful ways. If someone only sees fragments, their perception is built on fragments. There were also moments during the trial that challenged assumptions about credibility. Credibility isn't just about what is said, it's about how it aligns with evidence, how consistent it remains over time, and how it holds up under questioning. Both sides presented their versions, and both were examined in detail. But what stood out to many observers was how the accumulation of evidence began to tell a more layered story than the initial headlines ever suggested. Outside the courtroom, interviews with legal analysts after each day of proceedings helped break down what had happened. Experienced attorneys explained why certain questions were asked, why specific pieces of evidence were introduced, and what impact they could have on the case. These analyses provided clarity for those willing to go deeper. They highlighted that legal battles are not decided by a single moment, but by a series of interconnected facts that either support or weaken a claim. Another overlooked factor is the emotional toll of public trials. When a case becomes global, every detail is scrutinized, every reaction is interpreted, and every statement is dissected. This creates an environment where pressure is constant. While the legal process focuses on facts, the human experience within that process is far more complex. Reactions that might seem unusual in isolation can be influenced by stress, fatigue, and the awareness of being watched by millions. As the trial progressed, patterns began to emerge, patterns that didn't fit neatly into the original narrative. There were moments of contradiction, moments of alignment, and moments that required careful interpretation. This is what makes real cases difficult to summarize in simple terms. They are not built on single events, but on sequences of actions and reactions over time. One particularly important aspect was how documentation was used. Text messages, emails, and recorded conversations became central pieces of evidence. Unlike verbal claims, these forms of communication provide a record that can be analyzed directly. However, even these require context. A message can mean different things depending on what came before and after it. During the trial, attorneys repeatedly emphasized this point, that isolated pieces of evidence should not be interpreted without understanding the surrounding circumstances. This emphasis on context is where many public discussions fall short. Online conversations often focus on individual clips or quotes, treating them as complete representations of events. But in reality, they are only parts of a much larger picture. The trial demonstrated how misleading partial information can be, even when it is technically accurate. There is also the question of how reputations are formed and reformed. Once a public figure is associated with a particular narrative, that association can persist even after new information emerges. This is not just about one individual, it reflects a broader pattern in how society processes controversy. Initial impressions carry weight, and reversing them requires more effort than forming them in the first place. By the later stages of the proceedings, something subtle but important had shifted. More people were engaging with primary sources, watching full testimonies, reading court documents, and comparing different interpretations. This doesn't mean everyone reached the same conclusion, but it does mean the conversation became more informed for those who chose to engage deeply. And still, even with all the available information, the divide in perception remained. Some viewed the case through the lens of early narratives, while others based their understanding on the evidence presented over weeks of testimony. This divide highlights a fundamental challenge: truth is not just about what exists, but about what people are willing to examine. As closing arguments approached, both sides summarized their positions, each emphasizing the evidence that supported their claims. This is a critical moment in any trial, where complex details are distilled into a coherent narrative for the jury. The goal is not just to present facts, but to connect them in a way that makes sense. And in this case, those narratives were shaped by weeks of testimony, documentation, and cross-examination. The jury's role was not to decide based on public opinion, but on what had been proven within the courtroom. This distinction is essential. Outside, opinions can be influenced by trends, emotions, and incomplete information. Inside, the standard is evidence, what can be demonstrated, supported, and verified under oath. When the verdict was eventually reached, it reflected that process, not the noise surrounding it, but the structured evaluation of claims and counterclaims. And yet, even then, the broader conversation did not settle. Discussions continued, interpretations varied, and perspectives remained divided. This is the nature of high-profile cases, they don't end with a decision, they evolve. What remains important, however, is the reminder this situation provides. That initial narratives are not always complete. That evidence matters, but only if people are willing to look at it. And that understanding something fully requires more than a quick reaction, it requires time, attention, and a willingness to question what seemed obvious at first. And that willingness to question what seemed obvious at first is where the deeper reality begins to surface, because once the noise fades and the headlines stop dominating attention, what remains are the details that were always there but rarely examined closely. In the case involving Johnny Depp, those details didn't just exist in isolated pieces of evidence, they existed in patterns that stretched across years, patterns that only became visible when everything was placed side by side instead of being viewed in fragments. One of the most revealing aspects of the trial was how narratives can be constructed through repetition. When a specific version of events is repeated often enough, it starts to feel definitive, even if it is incomplete. This is not necessarily intentional in every case. Sometimes it happens because early reports rely on limited information, and those reports get amplified before further verification takes place. But once that initial version spreads, it creates a foundation that is difficult to challenge. Any new information has to compete with what people have already accepted as truth. During the proceedings, there were multiple instances where earlier claims were compared directly with documented evidence. This is where the difference between assertion and verification becomes clear. Assertions can be powerful, especially when they are emotional or dramatic, but verification requires consistency, documentation, and the ability to withstand scrutiny. When these two collide, the outcome is not determined by which one is louder, but by which one holds up under examination. This is why the structure of a courtroom matters so much. Unlike public discourse, where statements can circulate without challenge, the legal process is designed to test every claim. Cross-examination is not just about asking questions, it is about revealing gaps, clarifying timelines, and ensuring that statements align with evidence. During the trial, this process exposed areas where narratives were either incomplete or inconsistent. These moments did not always trend online, but they played a crucial role in shaping the final understanding of the case. Another important factor is the role of documentation over memory. Human memory is not perfect, it can be influenced by time, stress, and perception. Documentation, on the other hand, provides a fixed reference point. Text messages, emails, medical records, and audio recordings do not change based on interpretation. However, they still require context to be understood correctly. During the trial, both sides presented documented evidence, but the interpretation of that evidence depended on how it connected to the broader timeline of events. For example, audio recordings that were introduced during the proceedings revealed conversations that were far more nuanced than what had been publicly discussed before. These recordings showed moments of conflict, but also moments of acknowledgement and complexity that did not fit a one-dimensional narrative. When people heard these recordings in full, rather than as short clips, their understanding began to shift. Not necessarily in a single direction, but toward a more detailed perspective. This highlights a critical difference between information and interpretation. Information is the raw data, what was said, what was recorded, what was documented. Interpretation is how that information is understood. And interpretation can vary depending on what pieces of information are included or excluded. When only selective parts are shared, the interpretation becomes limited. When the full context is available, the interpretation becomes more balanced. The trial also demonstrated how quickly public opinion can move, but also how resistant it can be to change. At certain points during the proceedings, there were noticeable shifts in how people discussed the case online. Clips of testimony began circulating that challenged earlier assumptions, and for some viewers, this led to a re-evaluation of their views. But for others, those same clips were dismissed or reinterpreted to fit their existing beliefs. This is not unusual, it reflects a broader tendency to protect previously formed opinions. What makes this particularly significant is the speed at which those initial opinions were formed. In the early stages of the controversy, information spread rapidly across platforms, often without verification. People reacted in real time, forming conclusions based on what they saw in the moment. But the legal process operates on a completely different timeline. It moves slowly, deliberately, and with an emphasis on accuracy rather than speed. This difference creates a gap between perception and verification. As more evidence was presented, that gap became more visible. Details that had been overlooked or ignored began to gain attention. Inconsistencies that had not been widely discussed were examined more closely. And gradually, the narrative that had once seemed straightforward became more complex. Complexity, however, is not always comfortable. It requires people to hold multiple perspectives at once, to accept that situations can involve conflicting truths rather than a single clear answer. Another dimension that became apparent during the trial was the influence of external commentary. Outside the courtroom, commentators, influencers, and media personalities offered their interpretations of what was happening. Some provided detailed analysis based on the evidence presented, while others focused on more sensational aspects. This created an environment where information and opinion were often mixed together, making it difficult for casual observers to distinguish between the two. This is where critical thinking becomes essential. Understanding a case like this requires more than just consuming content, it requires evaluating sources, comparing information, and recognizing when something is being presented out of context. During the trial, those who took the time to watch full testimonies or read official documents had access to a more complete picture than those who relied solely on short clips or summaries. There is also the question of how outcomes are interpreted after the fact. When the verdict was announced, it marked the conclusion of the legal process, but not the end of public discussion. Reactions varied widely, with some viewing the outcome as validation of one perspective and others questioning its implications. This divergence highlights the difference between legal conclusions and personal beliefs. A court decision is based on evidence presented within a specific framework, while personal beliefs can be influenced by a wider range of factors. In interviews following the trial, legal experts emphasized that the case was not about proving a perfect narrative, but about determining whether specific claims met the required standard of proof. This distinction is important because it underscores the limits of what a legal decision represents. It does not necessarily resolve every question or address every aspect of a situation, it focuses on the claims that were formally presented and tested in court. At the same time, the trial served as a broader case study in how modern information ecosystems function. It showed how quickly narratives can form, how selectively information can spread, and how difficult it can be to correct misconceptions once they take hold. These patterns are not unique to this situation, they reflect larger trends in how people consume and process information in a digital age. And perhaps the most lasting takeaway is not about any single piece of evidence or any single moment in the trial, it is about the importance of looking beyond the surface. Because what the world often gets wrong is not just the details of a specific case, but the process of understanding itself. Jumping to conclusions, relying on incomplete information, and resisting new evidence are patterns that extend far beyond one story. As the dust settled and the intensity of the moment began to fade, what remained was a more detailed record of events than had ever been publicly available before. That record does not fit neatly into a simple narrative. It contains contradictions, confirmations, and complexities that require careful consideration. And for those willing to engage with it fully, it offers something more valuable than a quick answer. It offers a deeper understanding of how truth is shaped, challenged, and ultimately revealed over time. And that deeper understanding doesn't come from choosing a side, it comes from recognizing how easily a story can be shaped before all the facts are even available. What happened in this case is not just about one individual or one dispute, it reflects a larger system where perception can be built faster than truth can be verified. And once that perception is established, it begins to influence everything that follows. One of the most important elements that became clear over time was how much weight people place on first impressions. The moment a narrative is introduced, it creates a mental framework. Every new piece of information is then filtered through that framework. If something fits, it is accepted quickly. If it doesn't, it is questioned or ignored. This is why early reporting carries so much influence. It doesn't just inform, it frames. In the situation involving Johnny Depp, that framing happened rapidly. And by the time more detailed evidence was presented, many people had already formed conclusions. Changing those conclusions required not just presenting new information, but overcoming the psychological resistance that comes with admitting an initial judgment may have been incomplete. This resistance is not always conscious. Often, it operates in subtle ways. People might say they are open to new information, but still interpret that information in a way that aligns with what they already believe. This is how two people can look at the same evidence and reach completely different conclusions. It's not just about the evidence itself, it's about the lens through which that evidence is viewed. During the trial, there were multiple points where that lens was challenged. Evidence was introduced that did not align neatly with the dominant narrative. Testimony revealed details that added layers of complexity. And for those paying close attention, it became clear that the situation could not be reduced to a simple storyline. There were contradictions, yes, but there were also confirmations. There were moments that supported one perspective and moments that supported another. This is where many discussions struggle, because complexity does not provide easy answers. It requires holding multiple ideas at once, even when they seem to conflict. It requires acknowledging uncertainty, even when certainty feels more comfortable. And in a world that rewards quick opinions, taking the time to fully understand something can feel like going against the current. Another factor that played a significant role was the difference between private reality and public perception. What happens behind closed doors is often very different from how it is later described or interpreted. When those private moments are brought into the public eye, they are filtered through language, memory, and intention. And each of those filters can alter how the events are understood. This is why recorded evidence became so important during the proceedings. Unlike recollections, recordings provide a direct window into what was said at a specific moment in time. But even then, interpretation matters. Tone, context, and surrounding circumstances all influence meaning. A single sentence can be understood in different ways depending on what led up to it and what followed. Throughout the trial, there were instances where recordings were played in full, allowing listeners to hear conversations without interruption or editing. For many, this was a turning point. Hearing complete exchanges provided a different perspective than hearing isolated clips. It revealed not just what was said, but how it was said, the pauses, the reactions, the shifts in tone that cannot be captured in text alone. This brings attention to another critical issue: how editing can change perception. When content is shortened or selectively presented, it can emphasize certain aspects while minimizing others. This is not always done with intent to mislead, but the effect can still be significant. During the trial, full context often told a different story than the snippets that circulated widely online. There is also the role of emotional response. Cases like this naturally evoke strong reactions. People connect with certain aspects, relate them to their own experiences, and form opinions based on those connections. Emotion is a powerful force in shaping perception, but it can also make it harder to evaluate information objectively. When something feels true, it is often accepted as true, even if the evidence is more complex. Legal proceedings, however, are designed to separate emotion from evaluation. This does not mean emotion is ignored, but it is not the basis for decision-making. Instead, the focus is on what can be demonstrated through evidence. This difference between emotional truth and legal truth is important. They are not always aligned, and understanding that distinction helps explain why public opinion and legal outcomes can sometimes diverge. As the case progressed, it also highlighted the importance of consistency. Consistency is one of the key factors in determining credibility. When statements remain aligned over time and across different forms of evidence, they are more likely to be considered reliable. When inconsistencies appear, they raise questions that must be addressed. During cross-examination, attorneys focused heavily on this aspect, comparing statements made at different times and in different contexts. These comparisons revealed areas where narratives had shifted. Sometimes the changes were minor, sometimes more significant. But each one contributed to the overall evaluation of the case. This process may seem meticulous, but it is essential in ensuring that conclusions are based on more than just surface-level impressions. Another important takeaway from the trial is how information is prioritized. Not all details receive equal attention. Some are highlighted repeatedly, while others are mentioned briefly or not at all. This selective attention shapes understanding. If certain facts are emphasized, they become central to the narrative. If others are overlooked, they fade into the background. During the proceedings, there were moments where less prominent details turned out to be highly relevant. Pieces of evidence that did not initially seem significant gained importance when connected to other information. This is why examining a case in its entirety is crucial. Individual elements may not tell the full story on their own, but together, they create a more complete picture. There is also the question of accountability, not just in terms of the individuals involved, but in terms of how information is shared and consumed. Media platforms, content creators, and audiences all play a role in shaping narratives. When information is shared without verification, it contributes to the spread of incomplete or inaccurate perceptions. When audiences accept that information without question, those perceptions become more deeply ingrained. This does not mean that responsibility lies with any single group, it is a collective process. But recognizing that process is the first step toward improving it. Taking the time to verify information, seeking out full context, and being willing to reconsider initial impressions are all part of a more informed approach to understanding complex situations. As time passes, the intensity of public attention naturally decreases. New stories emerge, and focus shifts elsewhere. But the impact of what happened does not disappear. Reputations, careers, and personal lives are affected in ways that extend far beyond the duration of the trial. This is another aspect that is often overlooked, the long-term consequences of short-term narratives. In reflecting on everything that unfolded, one of the most significant lessons is about patience. Truth, especially in complex situations, does not reveal itself instantly. It requires time, examination, and the willingness to look beyond what is immediately visible. Rushing to conclusions may provide quick answers, but those answers are not always accurate. And ultimately, what the world often gets wrong is not just the details of a specific case, it is the process of understanding itself. The tendency to simplify, to choose sides quickly, and to rely on incomplete information creates a gap between perception and reality. Closing that gap requires effort, but it also leads to a more accurate and meaningful understanding of what actually happened. Because when all the noise is stripped away, what remains is not a perfect story or a simple conclusion, it is a complex series of events that can only be understood by looking at the full picture. And that full picture, once seen clearly, often looks very different from the one that first captured everyone's attention. And once that full picture starts to come into focus, something else becomes clear: the real issue was never just about what happened, but about how it was understood by millions of people at the same time. Because in today's world, understanding is no longer shaped slowly, it is shaped instantly, collectively, and often imperfectly. And that creates a situation where perception can move faster than truth, but truth, when it finally arrives, carries far more weight for those willing to see it. In the case involving Johnny Depp, one of the most overlooked realities is how much of the conversation happened outside the courtroom before anything was proven inside it. This created a kind of parallel trial, one driven by opinion, reaction, and viral content. And while that parallel process has no legal authority, it has something equally powerful: influence. Influence over reputation, over opportunities, and over how a person is viewed long before evidence is fully examined. This is where the idea of perception damage becomes important. Once a public image is altered, the effects are immediate. Professional relationships change, public support shifts, and decisions are made based on what is believed rather than what is proven. And even if later information challenges those beliefs, the initial impact does not simply disappear. It lingers, shaping how future information is received. During the trial, there were moments where this gap between perception and evidence became especially visible. Details that had been widely accepted were re-examined under oath, with both sides presenting their interpretations and supporting materials. This process did not always lead to clear, simple answers, but it did reveal something crucial. That many widely held assumptions were based on incomplete information. One of the ways this became evident was through the careful reconstruction of events. Instead of relying on summaries, the court examined sequences, what happened first, what followed, and how each action connected to the next. This chronological approach is essential in understanding any complex situation. When events are taken out of sequence, they can create misleading impressions. When they are placed in order, patterns begin to emerge. Those patterns, in this case, pointed to a relationship that was far more complicated than the public narrative suggested. There were moments of conflict, moments of escalation, and moments where both sides contributed to the situation in different ways. This does not simplify the story, it complicates it. But that complication is closer to reality than any one-dimensional version. Another critical aspect that came into focus was the role of language. The way something is described can significantly influence how it is perceived. Certain words carry emotional weight, and when those words are used repeatedly, they shape the overall narrative. During the trial, attorneys paid close attention to language, clarifying what was meant by specific terms and how those terms aligned with the evidence. This level of precision is necessary in a legal setting, but it is often missing in public discussions. For example, the difference between an allegation and a proven claim is significant, but in everyday conversation, those distinctions are sometimes blurred. When that happens, assumptions can be treated as facts, and the line between possibility and certainty becomes unclear. The trial process works to restore that clarity by requiring evidence to support each claim. Another factor that influenced how the case was understood is the concept of visibility. Not all evidence receives the same level of attention. Some pieces become widely known, while others remain relatively unnoticed. This uneven visibility can create a skewed understanding of the overall situation. During the proceedings, there were important details that did not trend online but played a key role in the courtroom. This difference between what is visible and what is significant highlights a broader issue in how information is consumed. People often rely on what is most accessible, not necessarily what is most complete. And in a digital environment where algorithms prioritize engagement, accessibility is often determined by how attention-grabbing a piece of content is, not by how informative it is. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the accumulation of evidence began to form a more cohesive narrative, not a simple one, but a structured one. Each piece of testimony, each document, and each recording contributed to a larger framework that the jury had to evaluate. This framework was not built on isolated moments, but on the connections between them. The role of the jury is particularly important in this context. Unlike the public, which can react instantly and emotionally, the jury is required to deliberate carefully, considering only the evidence presented and the legal standards that apply. This creates a controlled environment where conclusions are based on structured evaluation rather than immediate reaction. When the verdict was reached, it reflected that process, a decision shaped by weeks of detailed examination rather than moments of viral attention. But even then, the broader conversation did not align completely with that outcome. Some accepted it, others questioned it, and many continued to interpret the case through the lens of their initial impressions. This ongoing divergence highlights a key reality, that truth and belief are not always the same. Truth is grounded in evidence and verification, while belief can be influenced by a wide range of factors, including emotion, identity, and prior experience. Bridging the gap between the two requires more than just presenting information, it requires a willingness to engage with that information openly. There is also the issue of how lessons are drawn from situations like this. It is easy to focus on the specifics of a single case, but the broader implications are just as important. This case demonstrates how quickly narratives can form, how difficult they can be to change, and how essential it is to approach information with a critical mindset. For content creators, journalists, and audiences alike, this serves as a reminder of responsibility. The responsibility to verify before sharing, to provide context alongside claims, and to remain open to new information as it becomes available. Without these practices, the cycle of incomplete understanding continues. For viewers, it also emphasizes the importance of patience. Taking the time to watch full testimonies, to read beyond headlines, and to consider multiple perspectives leads to a more accurate understanding than reacting to isolated moments. This does not mean withholding all judgment, but it does mean recognizing that initial impressions are often incomplete. As time moves forward, the intensity of public attention fades, but the underlying lessons remain. The way information is processed, the speed at which opinions are formed, and the challenges of correcting misconceptions are all part of a larger pattern that extends beyond any single event. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this: that understanding is not a passive process. It requires effort, attention, and the willingness to question what seems obvious. It requires looking beyond what is most visible and seeking out what is most accurate. And while that approach may not always provide immediate clarity, it leads to a deeper and more reliable sense of what is true. Because in the end, what the world got wrong was not just a set of details, it was the assumption that those details were complete from the very beginning. And once that assumption is challenged, everything else begins to shift. And once everything begins to shift, the final layer of understanding comes into view, not just what happened, but what it revealed about how people decide what to believe. Because at its core, this entire situation became less about a single story and more about a system where information, emotion, and timing collide to shape global perception in real time. What stood out most toward the end of everything wasn't a single piece of evidence or one defining moment, it was the accumulation. Days of testimony, hours of recordings, pages of documents, all coming together to form something that could not be reduced to a headline. And yet, for many, the headline remained the reference point. This is the power of first exposure, it anchors everything that follows. In the case involving Johnny Depp, that anchor was set early. And even as more detailed information became available, it competed against something that had already taken hold. This is why, even after the trial concluded, conversations continued to feel divided. People were not just discussing facts, they were defending the version of the story they had accepted from the beginning. But for those who followed the full process, something else became clear: that truth is rarely loud at the beginning. It builds quietly, piece by piece, often unnoticed until it reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. During the trial, that build-up happened through consistency. Consistent timelines, consistent documentation, consistent patterns that either aligned or conflicted with what had been previously claimed. Consistency is one of the strongest indicators in any investigation. When different forms of evidence point in the same direction, they reinforce each other. When they don't, they create tension that must be resolved. Throughout the proceedings, both of these dynamics were present. There were elements that aligned clearly, and others that required deeper examination. This process of examination is what separates assumption from verification. Assumptions can form instantly, based on limited information. Verification takes time, requiring evidence to be tested, compared, and confirmed. And in a world that values speed, that difference can create frustration. People want answers quickly, but accurate answers are rarely immediate. Another key insight that emerged is how narratives are maintained even in the face of new information. Once a narrative becomes part of public identity, changing it is not just about accepting new facts, it is about letting go of a previous position. And that can be difficult, especially when that position has been expressed publicly. This is why debates around this case continued long after the verdict, because they were not just about the case itself but about the perspectives people had already committed to. There is also the role of selective memory. Over time, people tend to remember the parts of a story that align with their beliefs and forget the parts that don't. This creates a version of events that feels complete, even if it is not. During and after the trial, different groups focused on different aspects, each constructing a narrative that felt consistent from their point of view. This selective focus is reinforced by the environments people engage with. Online platforms often create spaces where similar perspectives are repeated and validated, while opposing views are minimized or challenged. This can lead to a sense of certainty that is not necessarily based on a full range of information. The trial, however, provided something different: a centralized source of information that anyone could access. Full testimonies, direct evidence, and unedited exchanges were available for those willing to engage with them. This level of transparency is rare, and it offered an opportunity to move beyond filtered interpretations. For many, that opportunity led to a reevaluation. Not always a complete reversal, but a shift toward a more nuanced understanding. Instead of seeing the situation in absolute terms, they began to recognize the complexity involved. And that recognition is important, because it reflects a move away from reaction and toward analysis. Analysis requires effort. It requires comparing sources, questioning assumptions, and being willing to sit with uncertainty. But it also leads to a more accurate understanding. In this case, that understanding revealed that the initial narrative was not entirely reflective of the full set of facts presented later. This does not mean that every question was answered or that every detail became clear. Complex situations rarely offer complete resolution. But it does mean that the conversation moved closer to reality than it was at the beginning. Another important aspect to consider is the long-term impact of how this case was perceived. Beyond the immediate consequences, it has influenced how similar situations are viewed in the future. It has raised questions about how quickly conclusions should be drawn, how evidence should be evaluated, and how much weight should be given to early reports. These questions do not have simple answers, but they are essential in improving how information is processed. If there is one lasting takeaway, it is that caution matters. Taking the time to verify, to understand context, and to remain open to new information can prevent the kind of misunderstandings that shaped the early stages of this case. It also highlights the importance of accountability in information sharing. When incomplete or misleading narratives are amplified, they can have real consequences. Recognizing this responsibility is a step toward more accurate and balanced discussions. As everything settles, what remains is not just a record of events, but a reflection of how those events were interpreted. And that reflection shows both the strengths and the weaknesses of modern information systems. The strength lies in the ability to access information quickly and widely. The weakness lies in how that information is sometimes processed without sufficient context. Moving forward, the challenge is to bridge that gap, to combine speed with accuracy, accessibility with depth, and reaction with reflection. This is not an easy balance to achieve, but it is necessary for a more informed understanding of complex situations. And in the end, the untold part of this story is not hidden because it was unavailable, it was hidden because it required more effort to see. It required looking beyond the surface, beyond the headlines, and beyond the immediate reactions. And for those who took that step, the story that emerged was not simpler, but it was more real. Because what the world got wrong was not just the conclusion, it was the process of getting there. And once that process is understood, it changes how every similar story will be seen in the future. Now you've seen the side of the story most people never took the time to understand, not the loud version, not the viral version, but the complete picture built on evidence, context, and what was actually said under oath. So the real question is, how many other stories have been shaped the same way without you even realizing it? If this changed the way you see things, then don't just scroll away. Take a second, drop your honest opinion below, and tell me what you think was most misunderstood. And if you want more real, fact-based breakdowns like this, make sure you stay connected, because the next story might be one everyone else gets wrong too.